Hello, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at a slice of a Talks at Google event that took place 2 days before Donald Trump was inaugurated back in January. The exceedingly subtle title of the talk is The Responsibility and Role of White People in Responding to Racism. As you might already be able to tell, we're in for a bumpy ride. So, let's begin.
For those who are watching on the live stream around the country and around the world at Google campuses, welcome to this conversation. My name is Michael Skolnick. I am white, so I get that out of the way. Everyone's head like, he's white.
I'll just say this once to cover the bases for the rest of the video. There is a word for people who focus inordinately on race. Just saying.
I want to get that out of the way in the beginning, but I also think it's important for this conversation when talking about race also to identify your perspective. So as a white, straight man who was born in this country, I'm coming with that perspective.
Translation. Everything I might say or do is coming from a place of privilege, which I acknowledge openly, and thus I am a better sinner than those regular sinners. But despite this confession, understand that I shouldn't be considered entirely trustworthy.
So to the right of me, Dr. Tia Martin. Dr. Martin has an amazing job. When I heard her title, I thought I wanted to work for you. She is the Chief Resiliency Officer for the city of Boston, which is pretty amazing job. She worked for the mayor here, Mayor Walsh, and she and the mayor have decided that they will focus their efforts of resiliency on racial equity here in the city. So she is here to talk about those efforts as well as the city's efforts and the city of Boston's history. So Dr. Tia Martin.
Racial equity, not equality, equity. And what is equity? Justice according to natural law or right. So, racial justice. I am running into that phrase a lot lately. But let's get to know our speakers. What exactly is a resiliency officer? I'd never heard of it before. Well, it's a position wholly funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, a 501c3 charity. The Resilience Program funds 100 select cities to be more resilient, which apparently includes everything from post-disaster management to race relations. So, it's an unelected governmental position paid for by an outside interest. Okay. It's a 2-year posting, which our panelist gained on August 25th, 2015. So she has less than a year left in her position as of the recording of this talk. Well, what has the Resiliency Office of Boston done in the last year and a half? 5 press releases in a year and a half. One announcing her appointment to the position, one wishing a happy New Year's for 2017, the others mention Dr. Martin and the office peripherally, but have more to say about the mayor's work than anything else. And what is Dr. Martin's overarching belief? Racism is an issue that cuts across every institution, in every city, and every community in the United States. Nothing is free from the infection. Noted. Moving on.
To the right of her is Tim Wise. I wrote I'm not much of a writer, but I wrote a piece a few years back when Trayvon Martin was killed that was said, "Dear white people, you will never look suspicious like Trayvon Martin." And the most amount of response I got was, they said, "You sound like Tim Wise." And I took it as a great compliment because he is an extraordinary writer, and author, and educator, and scholar on this issue, anti-racist worker. He has written books that I've read and I love, Dear White People, White Like Me, and he is here from Nashville, Tennessee. Tim Wise.
I could go on for a very long time about Tim Wise. Other YouTubers and writers have already done so, and I would be wholly outshined by any one of them were I to take the time to attempt it. But in short, Tim Wise is an anti-racism activist who writes books entitled White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, and Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. He promotes guilt and victimhood based on skin color, both in himself and in others. That's the short version. So, moving on.
I have the great pleasure of meeting this man today. He has come from the farthest place, but yet Boston is his native home. But he was gracious enough to hop on a plane from Northern Ireland, where he is writing his third book literally 2 days ago, and is going back across the pond to continue writing. Wanted to be part of this conversation. Michael McDonald is born here in the city of Boston, is an author, is a community organizer, is a teacher. He's a professor at Northeastern and Harvard. That's the New York way of saying it, but let him say it in a much more beautiful accent than I have. But he wrote the amazing book, All Souls, which if you haven't read, you should pick up. And he'll talk about that book today and his experiences growing up in South Boston. Michael McDonald.
I cannot find much on Michael McDonald, save for his mentioned book, All Souls, which chronicles his growing up in South Boston and the events affecting him and his family due to crime, violence, and drugs that plague the area, and still do. I'm finding out about what he thinks by watching this talk. But if you know anything more about him that's not covered here, please let me know in the comments.
Last piece of context here. The next 4, so we encourage all of you to keep watching. We're going to Ann Arbor next Thursday. DeRay McKesson, Michael Eric Dyson, Angela Rye are going to join us for a conversation on Black people. And then we're going to go and continue that conversation on the Latinx experience, and then on AAPI. And then we'll get into sort of the intersectionalities and microaggressions and have deeper conversations. So this is the first of sort of the next 4 parts of this series that's focusing on one particular racial identity. So if they're in the room, say, why aren't you talking about those people? We're going to get to everybody, hopefully.
Oh God, this is a series? Heaven help me. Though it might give me more material.
But this particular conversation, we want to focus around the experience of white people, of how they respond to racism, how we also partake in racism, how we might have been taught racism, which I can elaborate as I have a 3-year-old child and now see my 3-year-old child being taught how to be a racist in this country.
Your 3-year-old is being taught to be a racist. So doesn't that mean that you... No, let's wait. I honestly can't wait to hear him explain how his 3-year-old is already a racist.
So, Tim, I'm going to start with you, because you wrote a beautiful memoir, powerful memoir, White Like Me, and also wrote a letter to white America, Dear White People. How do you define the white identity in this country? And then talk to us a little bit about when people use the word whiteness, what does that mean?
Well, first let me say I don't want to take credit for Dear White People. That was a really good movie done
Dear
by
White
folks of
America.
color. Yeah. I don't want to take credit for white folks take credit for a lot of stuff we didn't do. I don't want to take credit for that.
Thank you for clarification.
Yeah, that's a brilliant film. I had nothing to do with it.
White people take credit for things they did not do. Got it. Oh, don't mind me. I'm just taking notes on how the color of my skin defines my personal character and motivations. Please continue.
I did write a book called Dear White America before that, so I'll own that one. As far as whiteness and the whole idea of white racial identity, to me is sort of funny because, and this is something we really need to understand. It seems like a history lesson, but it's important, right? Is that this is really just sort of this fictive notion. It's this made-up, concocted identity. It doesn't have any historical or cultural meaning. Those of us of European descent certainly weren't white when we came. The Irish weren't white. The Italians weren't white. Jews from Eastern Europe weren't white. Even the Anglos weren't white. We didn't use that terminology in Europe. We spent most of our time we weren't one big team. I hope you know. Like for those of us, we spent most of our time killing each other.
Oh, white people aren't a collective, but white people take credit for things they did not do. Makes perfect sense.
Or trying to figure out who the witch was. Like that was basically European history in a thumbnail sketch, was killing each other and looking for the witch. And so the idea that we were all one big happy team called white people or the white race is nonsense. That is an identity given to those of us of European descent in the colonies. It didn't really exist as such in Europe. My great-grandfather, when he came from Russia as a Jewish immigrant in the early 1900s, he didn't know he was white till he got here. The Irish didn't know they were white until they got here, and they were essentially told, you're either going to get down with this, you're going to get down with the same people who've been oppressing you forever, right, in a colonial relationship, or you're going to continue to be marginalized. And so white identity was this, it was sort of it was like a coin of the realm, right? That if you were of European descent, this would give you a certain in.
So white people were press-ganged into considering themselves white in order to fit in and get along with everyone else. Okay.
Now, there was still going to be massive inequality within that group called white, but you had the ability to feel like you're on the team. And then the question is, why did that happen?
So even if you considered yourself white, you were still subject to inequality amongst others who also considered themselves white, which everyone was forced to do in order to get along and have a certain in. Got it.
It didn't just happen in some abstract way. It happened as a way for rich people who owned all the land in the colonies before we became a country to figure out how they could divide working people from one another. It's a way of saying, you don't have anything, but at least you have what W.E.B. Du Bois would later call the psychological wage of whiteness, right? You don't own any land, you don't own anything, you're poor, you're essentially peasants, but you're on our team, you're wearing our uniform. We put you on the slave patrol. We gave you a gun and a badge and a horse. Right? And you're going to keep those people in line, even though they're barely above you. You may be indentured servants, or you were, until very recently. So white identity was this thing that was used to keep us from realizing the commonality of interest that most of our ancestors had with African enslaved folks, with the indigenous people whose land was being taken, later with Chinese Americans who were brought here to work on the railroad to build the transcontinental economy. So it was a trick. And I think we need to understand that, because when we have political conversations around, how are we going to reach out to the quote-unquote white working class? There's no such thing as the white working class separate from the working class, right? There are working class people who are now called white, but as long as they continue to think of themselves as white first, as James Baldwin said, as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you.
As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you.
My name is Michael Skolnick. I am white.
Well, that's an interesting notion. But back to something else you said. There's no such thing as the white working class separate from the working class. On that point, I guess I can tentatively agree, because wealth and class is something that can be measured to an extent and is not an arbitrary trait in a person, like skin color. So, white as an identity is a false label. And yet the title of your book, White Like Me, would seem to imply that you do consider white as a useful label for yourself. So I guess, according to James Baldwin, there's no hope for you. Right, Tim?
He was talking to us. He was saying, as long as you buy into that as a truly meaningful category of superiority or whatever, you'll never act in solidarity with other people. And so
white working class people, which there's no such thing as, all think of themselves as white first, that this makes them superior. So all white working class people are white supremacists. Got it.
I hope that we can begin to recognize the way and talk about the way that whiteness as a concept has really stolen, frankly, from us the real interesting cultural heritages of the people from whence we come. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting culture in Europe, but we gave that up for the sake of advantage relative to, let's say, black and brown folk.
We gave up our ancestral cultures in exchange for whiteness. So the cultures of our ancestors are neither celebrated by or reflected in the lives of white people in America. Got it.
And I think the cost of that has been immense in the sense of what we have lost, giving away traditions and cultures and customs that kept our people together for the sake of gaining relative advantage over other folks with whom we not only have a lot in common, but with whom we need to be organizing for real social change that would benefit us all.
So, wow, I never heard it put that way.
I agree. I don't think I've ever heard something put that way before either. It was unique. But be careful, it's coming from a straight white male, so be wary.
You talked about Irish and immigrant populations, and certainly this city has a tremendous history, certainly with Irish and Italians and immigrant populations. So, Atia, I'm curious, from a historical, I know you're not a historian, but you work so deeply in the pulse of the city, right? The heartbeat of this city, the resilience of the city. From a historical perspective, how has Boston dealt with race? How have they not dealt with race? How have white people interacted with this concept? Where has Boston done well? Where have they had trouble? I'd love to just sort of get some context around the place we're in today. And for those who are watching, certainly around the country, I think it's important for us to have that context in this room.
I am interested to know as well. From her declarations in the press, I already have an image of where she's coming from, but I'd much rather hear from her directly.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to follow your lead and just put out there identity-wise who I am. I am not white. So there's that. Then there's the fact that I identify as African American, and my husband and I have 5 children, and
just
we both grew up.
Just five kids. You gotta get for it.
Let's get married.
All right, but I want lots of kids.
Me too. 500 of them.
Yeah, babies everywhere.
That's a hand clap for our
hard work,
questionable mental status. But just as we think about the city of Boston and the history of having conversations about race and racism, so we've always had pockets of conversations happening. There are a lot of activists and folks who have been doing education, including folks up here, on these issues for many years. So this isn't something that's completely new to the city. What's new is having a shared conversation, getting on the same page about language.
Getting on the same page with language. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
This is actually the first time the city is prioritizing a citywide conversation about racism. And there were some attempts after busing, actually, which is one of the most interesting points in our history in terms of the city of Boston that most people associate with our identity.
The busing program that ran from the mid-1970s through the late 1980s is an important component to the specific conversation about Boston. Thankfully, Michael McDonald will give us a very good breakdown about what it was and the effects it had in just a little bit.
There's lots of amazing images and videos that folks have been exposed to that paint a picture of the city of Boston that from the 70s that still exists today. And so we have this image of being a very white city. We have an image of being a city that struggles with race and racism, and in fact, that we are one of the most racist places in all of the country. There was some research done that showed that Boston was in the top 10 places that people of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos, did not want to visit, right?
Wow.
So we have an image challenge. Now, what's interesting is that the city of Boston currently is, based on 2000 and 2010 census records, is a city that's predominantly people of color.
So the white population in Boston is the minority? Noted.
And most people don't know that about the city of Boston. Most people don't know all of the interesting cultures and diversity that we have in the city, and all that has been contributed by all of those different cultures to what we see today in Boston in terms of our history, in terms of things that are happening today in communities.
Well, by cultures, you must mean non-white cultures, because according to Tim Wise, all European cultures were left behind so that whiteness could be adopted instead. See? I learned something today.
And so we have a challenge in terms of an uphill battle around image. We have a challenge in terms of celebrating the diversity in a way that people who aren't from Boston can see with their own eyes what Boston really is today, and all the opportunities that we have to be a leader in this country around how we can have these shared conversations as a city. And what's interesting, the last thing I'll say is this idea of racism has been a challenge for me to watch play out in public discourse, whether you're watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox or any station or any popular media that's talking about these issues, just how narrowly focused and oversimplified we've made the issues. We've made it about interpersonal interactions as opposed to the true systemic nature of the issue, because of our long history of policies, of practices, of culture that led us to where we see today in terms of inequities associated with race. And the last thing I'll say is...
I thought that was the last thing you were going to say, but we'll get to that in a second. So, racism is not an interpersonal issue, it's a systemic issue. Racism is part of the system. Well, what system? I mean, you're working in city government, so presumably you're part of the system. White people are the minority in Boston, so non-white people hold more populist sway. So, does this mean that you're a racist?
When we think about racism, for us to challenge ourselves to not play the game of calling out the racist, right? Because I'll tell you, it's just a cover. It allows us to stand behind pointing our fingers at other people and what those racists over there are doing, or what that racist over there said, as opposed to the fact that we all grew up in this country. We're all infected with the disease that leads to, or the virus that leads to the disease of racism, right? We're all infected with it, whether we're white or whether we're people of color, and the way that it plays out to hold up the overall system and the institutions and the overall culture is what I oftentimes struggle with in these conversations, that we are not afraid to actually go there in the conversations and really have a deeper level of engagement, and challenge ourselves to not point the finger at other people, but point it back at ourselves and say, what is my personal responsibility in this? Because we all have a racial identity journey to take. I have one to take as a person of color, as a Black woman, and white people have a racial identity journey to take, and that we all have to take that responsibility on. And institutions have an institutional responsibility to take these issues on in terms of doing things like Google is doing today, as well as looking at policies and practices and how the organization itself can shift the way that it's doing business in order to support internally and externally the people that it serves.
We all have a racial identity journey. No, we don't. Or at least I hope we don't. Because if we're all thinking of ourselves first and foremost on how our skin color defines us, then yes, we truly all would be racist, and like James Baldwin said, there really would be no hope for us at all. Maybe that's what you are doing, but is that what you think others are doing? Is that how you look at other people and their actions and decisions as all being part of their racial identity journey? Because I don't see how that can be any kind of solution towards overcoming racial divisions if we're inherently defining ourselves and looking at others on the basis of skin color.
I want to come back to that idea and sort of what Tim was talking about, these structures that were set up 200-300 years ago, right, around power. And we talk about racism, right? People say, you know, well, what about reverse racism? Racism has to do with power, right? The person who is being racist is the one who is in power. So that's why we talk that white people have the institutional structural power.
Only white people can be racist because white people have all the power, because they're white. There are no black people with power. As you're sitting next to a black woman heading a governmental office in a major American city where white people are the minority. As, at the time this talk was recorded, the nation's twice-elected black president was getting ready to relinquish his position. Got it.
One thing I want to say, I want to come to you, Michael, to this point, which I think is a really interesting one. I teach race to white teachers of how to talk to their children who they teach.
Maybe this relates to why his 3-year-old is already a racist.
I travel the country and I do this sort of on my spare time because I enjoy that process. And one exercise we do, and something for you to think about when you go back to your offices or your home or your families, we ask this very simple question: what is white culture? And a lot of people in the room, they resist that question. There's no such thing as white culture. Okay, what is black culture? Soul food, rap music, R&B, right? They can rattle them off. Okay, what is Latino culture? Rattle them off. We come back to what is white culture. People have a very difficult time defining that.
Okay, well, rattle them off. What is white culture? What are the inherent cultural features of white skin? Go ahead. List them off. I mean, you must know, correct? You are a well-meaning white.
One thing that I argue that is rooted in whiteness and white culture is this idea of individualism, right? Which is part of what our country was founded on by white people.
White culture is individualism. So, this was how the Russians during communism operated, was it? Because they were white? They were all individualists, not collectivists. Man, I am learning so much today.
Right? The founding principles of our documents was this idea of individualism and the individual pursuit of happiness. And that idea, oftentimes when we talk about racism or we have an interaction around racism, we immediately want to go to the individual relationship. I'm not racist. I got a black friend. I'm not racist. I got a black boyfriend. I'm not racist. I have a black child.
And what would you expect a non-racist to say if they were to be falsely accused of racism? Does the color of their skin make them inherently dishonest to you? Do you understand how racist a notion that would be?
We don't want to get into the deeper conversations of the institutions and the structures where the racism is held up by.
Institutions like Google?
So, moving to Michael McDonald, you have a remarkable relationship with this city, complicated. The image that Atia spoke of and we talked about during lunch of the Matt Damons, the Ben Afflecks, the Mark Wahlbergs, this is like who we know is from Boston. I asked them how they felt about you. And you said Mark Wahlberg has 10 of your books, whatever that means. But you have such a unique story in this city, but not so unique. How has this city shaped you in your racial identity?
I was really mesmerized by Tim's It really encapsulated amazing history there of whiteness and of the construction of whiteness.
Yes, let us not forget that whiteness is a fabricated social construct, but that white people have all the power, and are all on a racial identity journey towards a fabricated social construct. Got it.
Among European peoples, I grew up in South Boston. I feel like growing up in South Boston, I experienced a microcosm of everything that you said that has happened over globally and across time. I grew up in South Boston in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and South Boston throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s held the highest concentration of white poverty in America.
White poverty? But white people have all the power.
It was highly concentrated poverty, so it was unusual in that a lot of poverty had spread to more rural and suburban places at that point. Growing up in that period, the busing riots happened at the end of my street when I was 8 years old in 1974. And I grew up in the housing projects, single mother, 11 kids. We lost, in the years after that, after the kind of closing down of the neighborhood, after busing, we lost four siblings in my family to poverty, crime, violence. Also a sister who's alive, but who's seriously brain damaged and partially paralyzed.
Jesus. That's legitimately awful. Single mother, 11 kids, and that much tragedy. This guy grew up under circumstances that no one could consider privileged.
The way desegregation was implemented, the schools were segregated and had to be desegregated, and that was a righteous decision. But the remedy was busing. So there's two different things. There's desegregation and there's busing. Busing was the remedy, and the way busing worked in Boston was to take two neighborhoods, to begin with two neighborhoods, South Boston and Roxbury. South Boston being all white, Roxbury being mostly black at the time, and to send them to each other's schools. Now, these also happened to be the two poorest neighborhoods. So South Boston, again, the highest concentration of white poverty in America. Roxbury was Boston's poorest black neighborhood. South Boston High School, so this was in response to a very righteous movement to desegregate the schools, led by people like Ruth Batson and some great iconic leaders, civil rights leaders we had in the city of Boston. But the way equity was going to be given was to, the way it was to be achieved was to send the African-American kids, and at the time the city was mostly a black and white city. The school population for Latinos and Asians was much smaller than it is today. But to get equity for black students who had horrible conditions in their schools in Roxbury was to send them to the white school with the most students on welfare citywide.
As I listen to Mr. McDonald speak about this, I cannot help but wonder if the good intentions of desegregation, implemented through the forced integration of peoples without their consent, isn't something of a metaphor and a warning about many of the diversity and inclusion programs that we see being implemented in businesses and governments lately. Just a thought.
So South Boston High School had the most 100% white, most students on welfare citywide. Also, at the time, the way that when they first decided to, rightly so, desegregate the schools, they were looking at how there was different allocation for funding in white school versus black schools. And so Boston allocated $450 per white student, $250 per black student. At the time, when this one of the leaders of the NAACP saw that what they were going to do with Southie and Roxbury, he pointed out that South Boston High School students actually got $150 per student. So that population got lumped in with whiteness and lost out as a result. But what's worse than that is that they jumped into that role, as you're saying, because the worst thing they could do is to identify and form movements of solidarity with those people, right? Because you don't want to be those people.
So some white students were being treated worse by the system than other white students, and at the same time also worse than black students. But I thought simply the factor of their being white was the game changer. Are you saying people were treated differently based more on class and geography rather than on their skin color? Because that can't be right. I mean, you and the others in South Boston were white. I mean, is whiteness a given advantage, or isn't it? You're confusing me.
So the otherness thing, led to the community clinging to this white identity. And to be honest, before that period, if anybody ever asked my own family or most people in the neighborhood, "What are you?" which was a question, white people could ask each other, and it's going to result in Polish or Italian, we always were Irish. Like, we never really thought in terms of white. It was after busing that white was kind of a more real thing in opposition to blackness, of course.
So prior to being treated a certain way based solely on your skin color, you identified with your own family culture first. A culture that was completely left behind generations ago in exchange for whiteness, like Tim Wise told us. Because white culture is individualism, the collective white culture is to maintain an individual identity. An identity that we all have a journey to take. Not an individual identity journey, a racial identity journey. Man, my head is spinning. How much more getting woke can I take?
But in that period, riots broke out throughout the city, mostly in Roxbury and South Boston. There was a lot of racism in South Boston, attacks on school buses full of black children. And the neighborhood dropped out of school at record rates. We also had the highest rate of dropout citywide. So the borders went up between our world and the world beyond. We had a huge population of high school dropouts, a population of really vulnerable, poor, single-parent, female-headed households in housing projects. And we then, in 1974, the same year, had a gangster come to ascendancy in 1974. In 1974, Whitey Bulger, who you've all probably heard about, came to ascendancy in the city of Boston. That's the year that the FBI took him in as an informant.
The entirety of the Whitey Bulger saga is absolutely incredible, and not in a good way. I honestly recommend that anyone listening to this look it up. It's something to behold.
And so he was given, in exchange for being an informant on the Italian mafia across town, he was given the right to do as he likes in our neighborhood. And so he flooded our streets in the following years with cocaine and crack. So we had a huge death rate from not only overdoses, we had the highest rate of overdoses in the city of Boston throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s in the post-Whitey period with heroin. But in those years, we had the highest death rate from drug trade, but also in the early 80s, when my brothers died, we had the fastest growing homicide rate in the city of Boston as well.
So South Boston, a majority white portion of the city, had the highest numbers in all of the worst possible metrics a city could have. Drugs, crime, poverty, violence. Shouldn't whiteness have prevented all of that? You all had the power of your skin color, right? Now, let me pause here, because Mr. McDonald is giving us facts and events from his life and growing up, which I am not meaning to discount or make light of. But unfortunately, he is providing us this information against the backdrop of the claims and statements made by his co-panelists and moderator. His life experiences, and that of his community, stand in stark contrast to the notion that his skin color somehow indemnified him, his family, or his community from the worst of hardships when, according to our other speakers, their being white should have somehow prevented it. I'm going to end it there. That covered about 1/3 of the almost 90-minute talk, and I think it was a decent summary of each speaker's high-level perspectives. A link to the full talk is in the description. Depending on how much of a mental masochist I am, I may or may not tackle another chunk of this talk, or maybe look at another of the talks in this series when they become available. If you're interested in seeing me cover this or any others like this, please let me know in the comments. As always, thank you for watching.